name is Lucas Ion. I am a mental health director for the Diversity Advocacy Committee. And in today's special episode, we are partnering with the Uddering Engineers podcast to bring you a mental health special. Now, in 2020 and 2021, work study from home really spotlighted how mental health is a really big issue for students. When we transition back to in-person schooling, how can we ensure the conversation doesn't stop as well? On today's episode, we have special guest Carmen Dodsworth, who's going to go over pressing questions that the student community have asked and go over other things that can help students deal with mental health in today's difficult climate. Carmen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So I just want to start off by asking you to introduce yourself and maybe going into a little detail as to what a psychologist does and is for students that maybe have some misconceptions about them or don't quite know what kind of services they offer.
Sure. Okay. So my name is Dr. Carmen Dodsworth, and I'm the clinical director and founder of the Practice Calgary. And as an outfit, we specialize in performance, wellness portfolios, as well as mental health. So there are misconceptions, and it's good that you raise that around psychology being kind of singularly focused on mental health, but really we look at human behavior, different components of relationship and wellness, and help people overcome obstacles to their wellness, actually.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. So in regards to mental health services, there's often some confusion between like psychiatry and psychology. So what would you say would be like the differentiator there?
So that's a easy distinction to make. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who has, completed medical school with a specialization in psychiatry. They focus on mental illness as diagnosed by the DSM-4 as well, in addition to lifestyle factors that contribute to the same. And a psychiatrist will be the person who is able to diagnose and prescribe medicine for a mental illness. Whereas a psychologist, we go through graduate school and our internship and intensive training around providing therapy, psychotherapy, diagnosis, and assessment. However, we do not prescribe medication.
Okay. That makes sense. Well, thank you very much for clarifying that. And I hope that can help students kind of get a picture of what exactly a psychologist is and does. So Carmen, I have a few questions prepared from you that the student community wanted to be asked. And I was hoping that you could give some responses on them. I just want to start off with, I think, what was one of the most pressing questions, especially given the climate that we find ourselves in now as students. Situated within the global pandemic in an online environment. And one of the most common questions students wanted answered is, how can they prevent themselves from burning out and ensuring that they stay motivated during COVID-19, given the circumstances that they find themselves in?
Okay, so I think the very first place to start with that is to kind of put it in context and normalize that even the best wellness strategies and the most academic students are feeling additional pressure right now. And one of the places where we're hearing a lot of reporting is around motivation. And if you think about it, a lot of times it is that classroom, social context, group environment that helps to motivate students and helps to energize us. We're social beings. So when we're now put into an isolated situation, it's very, very normal to be feeling kind of a difficulty getting up and getting going, particularly when many students are now, studying at home where the environment doesn't have that same academic kind of feel around it. So in addition to normalizing it, and so people don't add to their discouragement by starting to personalize it as though they're somehow failing as a student. You really have to look at, with burnout, a combination of wellness strategies and study strategies. And so, using the study strategies that many university students already understand around scheduling, and you can't cram stuff in at the last minute at this pace. But wellness strategies that we often like to overlook, including the importance of taking breaks, setting up some type of a social study system can be really helpful to keep the motivation and keep us on track and really taking care of yourself.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So just going a little bit more into like specifics, when you talk about like that dichotomy between like wellness like activities and the other type of activities you mentioned, so what are some examples of like wellness strategies people can employ? So you mentioned in involving yourself in like good social environments, but in the digital, I guess, commuting that we're partaking in now, are there any things that people can do individually for themselves to kind of mitigate the stresses that can be placed on them from that digital learning environment?
Yeah, so it becomes even more critical right now that we give ourselves breaks off screens. You know, our brains are not meant to live in a two-dimensional, constant input kind of place. And when we're staying at home, we're kind of overwhelmed by the pressure that's on us while we're underwhelmed by the amount of stimulation we're getting. So while we still enjoy nice weather, the idea of getting outside and moving your body and giving your brain other stimulus and inputs to kind of process, it becomes really important, not only to maximizing when you do sit down in front of a screen for a shorter period of time, maximizing your ability to pay attention to that stuff, but benefiting from the break that you get when you get out and get into that 2D world, 3D world. The other piece is when we're looking at things individuals can do for themselves, you think basic. Think about things like diet, water intake, exercise, and sleep. Those are the things that students are very prone to kind of throwing out the window when the pressure's on. But at the end of the day, it kind of decreases their stamina and ability to kind of finish that semester well. So that would be things that an individual could focus on.
Okay, that sounds like excellent advice. And I guess like the follow-up to question to that is, obviously students might feel like they need to like lack that motivation, but there also might be like external pressures on them. So for students that are feeling overwhelmed by like the sheer amount of work, and maybe the fact that they have to stay in their room for 8 to 10 hours a day to go between lectures, labs, tutorials, and study. What advice do you have for those students that might feel overwhelmed by the amount of work that is seemingly magnified by the environment that they're in right now?
Okay. So university is overwhelming to begin with, right? Most university students will report periods of just feeling there's way too much to do than I can get around to. So again, you have to look on the study skills side of it. Are you maximizing the amount of time that you're spending studying? Are you overstudying or studying areas where perhaps it's not a high focus area for that prof, but you just put that pressure on yourself to be able to, you know, just in case these 2-point questions come in, I better know that. So when our efficiency is going down, we need to be focused and studying more strategically. But I like what you say, like, I have to be in my room 8 to 10 hours a day. And my response to that would be, that is not healthy for anyone. So, you know, I don't know that you're going to have 10 hours of straight lectures. I do believe that you will feel that pressure to study for 10 hours a day. But again, looking at decreasing rate of return, you are going to get the maximum amount of that initial study period. Then you're just going to start to learn less and less. And then by the end of it, you actually can bring your grade down by overstudying in a state of fatigue. So resisting the urge to press yourself to stay in the same room for 10 hours a day and bringing in breaks to subject material and also breaks to your environment. You know, a half hour outside resting your brain before you go in will probably earn you, you know, as many percentage points as sitting and trying to cram in and focus your brain.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So if I'm understanding correctly, the key is not to homogenize your studying environment, take breaks, separate study periods, and don't try to think that because you're at home all day, that means you should be consistently studying all day, and that there should be periods of time where you're giving the ability to rest, where you're shifting your environment, where you're taking your mind off of school and refocusing on something that, like you mentioned, going outside, eating healthy, or something that could be productive, but also not exhausting. Is that correct?
Yeah, or something that's fun, even for a split period of time. But you raise a good point, is it's very similar to when we have people who historically work at home. The pressure to always be doing something and to feel like I must always be productive in and of itself can contribute a great deal of stress. So creating boundaries with yourself through even a study schedule of I can see where I'm going to take a break today and I'm going to hold myself to it. And I'm actually not going to feel bad about that. And I'm not going to put pressure on myself to be productive around the clock.
Okay, that makes that doesn't make sense. So I guess like the follow up to that, the inverse side is, what can we do as students? Obviously, being engineering students, there's a lot of sense of community that exists in the engineering community, but obviously that's difficult to see through to the same extent because we're online rather than in person. But as students, what can we do to maybe help someone else that's struggling or is feeling stressed? How can we, through this digital medium that we're in, try to reach out to them in the best way possible and help alleviate their stress? Do you have any strategies for that?
I mean, the number one thing, Lucas, is ask. If you think somebody is struggling, ask them if they're okay. And I think that's partly why you'll hear mental health professionals right now talking about it being okay to not feel okay right now, to not be getting the grades or not feel as competent as a student right now. And if we can, without dwelling on it in terms of a negative bias or a negative mindset, but if we can just acknowledge it's a really difficult time and it's okay to acknowledge that we're having a hard time, it invites other people to. But the thing that makes any struggle we go through feel worse is isolation. And so, whether it's sending somebody a message or text or in a group chat, just acknowledging and asking, how's everyone doing, can become open a conversation. I've worked with a lot of university students right now that, and I mentioned this when we started, is they have study accountability buddies. And all that is somebody that they know in their program who they're saying, I'm having a hard time keeping on track, keep going. How are you doing on that project? What are you going to get? And they're just bouncing it back and forth because, as supportive as our families are, they're not university students. You kind of need somebody on the inside that you can relate to, that's in a similar pressure point to help keep you going.
Okay, so I guess the point from that is that we shouldn't expect that, given the circumstances that we're in right now, that everything should be all fine and dandy and that everything should be okay, and that there has to be some sense of understanding that this is a difficult time for everyone and that everyone is going through an equally challenging period of time. And in that understanding, we need to be able to come together as a community and say, how can we help each other, rather than maybe trying to normalize the stress and ignoring the stuff that's going outside our window, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you have to normalize that, and you have to keep in mind one of the things that mental health and wellness is built on strongly is our adaptability. And so adaptability not only means, okay, now I have to adapt to online delivery and isolation and learning from home. So you've had to do that. But adaptability also means recognizing our expectations. So I may always require that I give 100%, but I have to allow for that 100% to fluctuate depending on what other factors are going on in my circumstances. So it's being adaptable with our expectations of ourselves and being adaptable to our environment.
Okay. Yeah, that's totally a great point. And I think that sometimes, especially in like high stress majors or even courses, there might be this sense that's fostered that if you're not sleeping only 2 hours and pulling all-nighters and you're not constantly exhausted, that you're not doing it right. What do you have to say about that mentality in terms of how it affects mental health, how it affects stress, how it affects performance in school?
Well, I mean, I would call that a toxic mindset. And I acknowledge that it exists more in certain programs than in others, and more in certain professions than in others, where we normalize really unhealthy behavior for as almost this is what it takes. This is the grit it's required to be in this program or to be in this profession. What that does is it actually prevents yourself and your peers and your future, coworkers from being able to set appropriate mental health boundaries. So, and to take care of themselves. And it's not a sustainable way of living. And having a discussion and giving yourself, being able to spot when you see those toxic mindsets around you, not as a way to blame others, but just being reflective and thoughtful about the idea that I have to only sleep 2 hours a night and that's okay in order to be trying my 100%. Just being reflective and aware of that and kind of stand back from that. And does that really resonate as true for a balanced in life?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess I want to kind of stay on that topic of like stress and how it affects us as students. And I think I've read that sometimes we can utilize stress in a healthy way rather than like allowing it to like take us down. But where is that line? Where is that fine balance in which stress is a motivator rather than something that's completely weighing on us and disallowing us from reaching our full potential? How can we as students kind of gauge where that line is, and when we can say we need to stop, take a break, and kind of refocus and readjust rather than trying to push through just for the sake of pushing through?
Excellent. So yes, stress does help us perform to a point. It helps the external pressure, helps us focus our attention. It helps us push a little further. And it actually makes us less likely to make errors, because if we're really hyper-focused on the critical nature of what we're doing, we can really outperform. Now, where you're going to start to see signs that it's gone too far is, first of all, when you start to pay attention to how you're doing outside of it. So if my stress levels related to school is getting big, but now I'm starting to fight with my family. Now I'm not sleeping. My diet is dropped down. And you can see how that balance starts shifting. And then what you might notice is it goes from stress to overwhelm or distress. Stress is more about, oh my goodness, I have a lot to do and I have to deploy my resources correctly to get these things done. There's a lot of demand on me. Whereas the distress and overwhelm, it goes to a mindset of, I can't do this. How am I ever going to get this done? And you'll start to notice real future-oriented type of thinking, focused on problems and focused on kind of catastrophic outcomes. So if a person is self-aware enough, they can say, when I think about school now, I just think I'm certain I'm going to fail. I can't take the time to make a meal. I absolutely have to stay up until 4 a.m. At that point, you can see you've way lost the balance of productivity.
Okay. So I guess the thinking is that when a student is adding like labels such as like, I must do something, or I need to do this, or if I don't do this, I'm gonna end up failing or something like that. So like, as soon as a student recognizing that they're catastrophizing or have catastrophic thinking, then that's a situation which you think they need to kind of like take a step back and separate themselves from those thoughts and readjust, or what do you think is the best course of action in that kind of situation?
Yeah, so it's requiring somebody to pay attention to behavioral shifts, to cognitive shifts. I'm becoming catastrophic and overly negative, and in relational shifts, right? Like I'm irritable, my mood is off. I'm not behaving in a way that I do when I'm well. So when a person notices that, first of all, it seems obvious that they need to do some activity to reduce the amount of stress hormones flying through their body. And so that most often is exercise and a shift from the activity that you're doing itself, even a shift from the room, right? Getting out of your bedroom, if that's where you're studying all the time, doing something else. And again, you got to help your body find a way to get rid of all of that stress, that the fight or flight response. And then once you've done that sort of piece, when I'm working with somebody, it's a lot about take a step back, right? We can problem solve through this, but once you're coping a little bit better. So take a step back, get a little perspective, listen to the way you're thinking, observe the way you're treating others, including yourself. Is that congruent with who you are? If not, let's build in some stress reducing activities like social connection, exercise, pay attention to your rest, and let's come up with and it doesn't have to be a restful study schedule, but let's come up with something that's going to work a little bit better for you. With a cognitive piece, absolutely. Listening to where my thoughts are becoming overly catastrophic, overly certain, like I'm sure I'm going to fail, and it's going to have long-standing outcome in my life that I'll never be able to work myself back from. Extreme styles of thinking lead to distress.
Okay. And I noticed you mentioned exercise and diet as two big things. And I feel like we hear this a lot as students, but I still think like the stereotype sometimes persists that as a college student, you're going to be reserved to ramen and Red Bull or a diet of that sorts. So do you mind just putting in perspective how important diet and exercise are in maintaining good mental health or putting yourself in the best position to succeed in regards to mental health?
Okay, absolutely. There is the stereotype of the ramen and Red Bull. I get that. When we look at mental health, we have to think about what's fueling your brain. We have to think about things like vitamins that help maintain mood, help your body deal with stress, things like vitamin B. We have to think about how stress causes inflammation in your system internally, and inflammation in your system is an underlying factor in depression. And we think about things about, eating fast foods and fatty foods can contribute to inflammation in your system. So we can see how those things contribute. We also know that when people are binging on carbs and then going for periods without, that their blood sugar becomes really unstable. And blood sugar instability often feels like and can exacerbate existing anxiety. So if we're thinking, I need the most out of my brain than I will probably need in my life, is to learn an entire new field of study and start from the beginning. I would like to have my education predicated on you're getting the best version of me. So yeah, so diet, we know it contributes to mental wellness, and we know it contributes to performance.
And what about caffeine? Because I've heard that caffeine can also have a pretty big impact on how someone's emotional state can be stable. Is that correct?
Yeah, it can. And so what I tend to say to people is like, you do an experiment. And so you figure out the impact of caffeine on you. So what we know is that caffeine kind of surges that adrenal system. Now, if you're already struggling with anxiety and you already go into a place of fight or flight too often, then adding caffeine into that, again, sometimes the things that we're doing are going to feel a lot like anxiety because physiologically they're the same. So it's going to amp you up, but it may be more related to lifestyle, or at least exacerbated by lifestyle. So caffeine is a big piece for obviously sleep deprivation, but maybe we're deprived of sleep because we're choosing to study anyway. Where it really contributes is around anxiety.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's excellent advice. And I think that sometimes we were exposed to so much caffeine that we think that it's a necessity in order to sustain us as students, but in reality, it might actually be deprecating us. And I noticed that you mentioned depression there. And one question we had is, what are like good coping mechanisms for someone who is struggling or dealing with depression, and that might have been happening before the pandemic, but also might have been amplified by the pandemic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think you are struggling with depression, I always recommend you talk to your doctor. And just talk about what's going on for you and see if you actually meet criteria for depression. A lot of times when somebody comes in for therapy with depression, they've let it go on for a protracted period of time because they just thought it was normal. And depression often sets in a very slow kind of way, so that the changes that are occurring over time aren't so blatant that the person is immediately alarmed by it. So getting your medical professional's opinion, therapy is an excellent way to help with depression, because a lot around depression, it can be internalized, has a lot to do with understanding what's going on for you, how you're feeling. But also we know with depression, there's a component of a tendency to ruminate, to think very negatively about yourself, to feel very out of control, but yet personally responsible for a lot. And those shifts, again, we know that there's some inflammation and there's vegetative shifts. So I get slower. It's really hard to get up and do things, even if I want to do them. And so I start to kind of fall behind. When I notice that I'm falling behind, I feel more and more pressure, and I start to think really negatively about myself. So sometimes when you're talking to people around you and you're talking to a professional, you can first of all find small ways to get back to your life and to feel a little less behind, but you can kind of start to understand that piece about that this is in fact a depression. This is not something that you caused, and this is not something to feel ashamed about. In terms of somebody who is saying, I do struggle with depression, and I'm in a pandemic, and I'm a student, what are some things I can do? Most therapy is going to focus on, and most strategies we have are going to focus hopefully on some level of behavioral activation. So setting small goals that you feel like, even though you won't have the motivation to do them, you can get up and do those things. Those things include, taking care of small tasks, taking some personal hygiene pieces, some exercise if possible, or some level of activity to keep going. And things like writing in a journal and starting to pay attention again to where my thoughts are actually my thoughts versus, being overly negative or overly focused on your own flaws. So, and that's really what cognitive behavior therapy is about, is teaching somebody about where their thoughts that they kind of just think is just the way everybody thinks, but have become overly negative and focused. So that's why, therapy, talking, and behavioral activation would be main places that you would want to start.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. That's an amazing response. And I hope for the students listening to this, they know that there's options available out there for them, and that there's strategies to help them get through what they're dealing with. Well, Carmen, that reaches the end of the questions that I wanted to ask. I guess I just want to finish off this session by just asking, what are the follow-ups? So for students that are listening to this and think that maybe they want to go down that mental health support route, what options are available to them in Alberta?
Oh, wow. Okay. So one of the main catch points for mental health concerns in Alberta is often your family physician. This is a person, hopefully in an ideal scenario, it's a person you've been with a long time, they know you, they can say, hey, something's not quite right. So reaching out to a family physician is always a good option. Talking to people who know you, like your parents, reaching out to them and whether or not you're feeling okay. There are a lot of services available through Alberta Health Services, which students can access through, or Albertans, can access through by calling Access Mental Health if the person in question is under 18. If they're over 18 and you're looking for Alberta Health Services support, again, the referral source becomes your family physician. There are always, of course, universities have great wellness services. Often, I don't know how they've been impacted by the pandemic, but I always encourage university students to look out for what resources are available to you right at your place of learning. And then in terms of in Alberta, there's also a network of community counseling or private psychotherapy or psychologists such as ourselves that you would tend to just call directly.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that response. And I hope that for students that might have been feeling overwhelmed or confused where to start to access mental health, I hope that kind of clears that up. Well, that is the end of all I wanted to talk about today. Thank you so much, Carmen, for sitting down with me. Once again, we all really appreciate it. And on behalf of Uddering Engineers and the Diversity Advocacy Committee, we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to sit down with us and answer some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. So once again, that was Dr. Carmen Dodsworth from the Practice Calgary. Thank you so much and have an amazing day, Carmen.